Hey class, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering here in chapters 9 and 10. You may notice these chapters are combined here in the modules. The reason is because in chapter 9, we're just going to cover a few topics. We're going to leave out probably the biggest topic in chapter 9, which is payroll. So we're not going to be responsible for payroll. I wish we had time to cover it, but we just don't in this course. But there are some topics in chapter 9 that we are going to cover. Probably the biggest one has to do with a topic we call contingent liabilities, or sometimes referred to as estimated payables. And I wanted to kind of read you the definition here first and then give you an example here. So by definition, you'll see in the book, it says a contingent liability is a potential obligation arising from a past event. The amount or existence of the obligation depends on some future event. It's kind of a strange definition, I know. The best way to kind of understand these is to really think about them in the form of an example. And one of the best or easiest examples here is like a lawsuit. All companies, big and small, will likely face, pending lawsuits for some reason or another throughout the time they're in existence. And we have to be able to evaluate those in accounting and decide what kind of impact they may have to our financial statements. So the FASB kind of put out a set of guidelines and how we kind of look at potential obligations that might result from something like a lawsuit being ruled against us. So let's go through an example of this. For instance, let's say we own like a small neighborhood, grocery store. And let's say a customer walks in, he walks into the produce department and slips and falls, right on his back. And hurts himself. And, of course, you're worried because he's getting a lawyer and trying to evaluate whether he's going to sue us or not. We get our lawyers together, try to evaluate whether or not we're, have some exposure here. And let's say that our lawyers start digging into this guy's background, and we find out that this guy has done this like numerous times, like 8 or 9 times before. He's gone into businesses and slipped and fall, and then files a lawsuit. Believe it or not, some people do this for a living almost. And what their hope is they're hoping to, not even necessarily get it to court. They're hoping that they could just sue you and then, have you settle out of court, because sometimes it's cheaper than taking it all the way to a lawsuit. But let's say your lawyers advise you that based on the circumstances of this particular case and the background that this guy has, that really, any chance, we could fight this. In other words, if we took this all the way to a jury, we would win absolutely. And our chances are remote that we would ever have to pay anything out. Well, under GAAP, there's different categories we would assign this. And one of them is the remote category. If we determine that this contingent liability has a remote chance of ever coming to some sort of an obligation, then there's really nothing we have to do. I mean, we just kind of just note it and move on, okay? Not much we got to do. Just kind of track what happens with it. All right, but let's change the example a little bit. Let's take the same example and we'll just tweak it a bit. Let's say this guy comes in and he slips and falls and he lawyers up and, we get to with our lawyer. This time we look into the guy's background and, he's like a neighborhood icon. He's has another business down the street that he's been there for 20 years. Everybody knows him. He's got, 3 kids and a wife, and he's a pillar of the community. It looks like it maybe just could have been a bad accident. And even though we maybe weren't necessarily at fault, we might have some exposure here because it happened in our business, right? And so we could take it to a jury. We could take it all the way through trial and hope we win, but we could also lose, right? In this particular case, our lawyers might advise us that we have the second category here, kind of a reasonably possible scenario where we might have an obligation, maybe a big obligation to pay for his medical expenses and what else, all right? Or that it's probable that we might have to pay something out, but we can't necessarily estimate because we don't have enough information yet how much we'd have to ultimately pay out. So in that case, we'd put it in the second category. And in the second category, what we would do then is we would include a note in our financial statements. Actually, if you look at our actual financial statements that we file, back behind the actual financial statements, you'll see a series of notes, those real detailed notes. And in those notes, we'd say, hey, we've got this potential obligation out there, this lawsuit, and we might have to pay something out. And, even though we might not have to put numbers in there because we may not know what they are yet, we would have to note it in the financial statements if it's in that second category. All right? Okay. Let's take one more example. Same example, we'll tweak it again. Let's say he comes in, slips and falls. This time we remembered, hey, we got cameras up in the store, right? We look at the cameras just before the incident happened, and we come to find out that one of our employees had just mopped that area, and they failed to put up those little, yellow cones up that said, hey, the place is wet, don't walk around here. And so, right after that, the customer came in, slipped right where he was mopping. Well, in that case, there's a pretty good chance your lawyer is going to tell you what? They're going to tell you you have a probable chance that you're going to have to pay something out, right? Probable. And if we can estimate that liability, in other words, if, we can look at like past cases and say, hey, in the past, these types of injuries, circumstances resulted in this kind of settlement, then what we would have to do then is we'd have to actually make a debit and credit entry onto our financial statements to reflect this estimated liability or this contingent liability, all right? So, and you'll see that there's some examples of that where you'll see those entries. But again, it's just an estimate. It's a little bit like, kind of reminds me a little bit of like when we did uncollectible accounts and we made an estimate of how many accounts we were going to collect on. This is a little bit like that too, even though we don't know the exact amount, we still have to make an entry to reflect that, all right? So lawsuits are probably the most common examples of contingent liabilities. Another really common one that you'll see talked about is warranties. Most companies who sell, say, a product usually issue a warranty with that product. And, it's usually probable that a certain percentage of, whatever products you're selling are going to come back and need to fix, right? For whatever reasons. And so if you can estimate that amount based on your history up front, what you think that liability is, then you've got to book an entry to do that. So those are two examples of contingent liabilities. All right, so I want you to focus on that. And there's a few other small topics in this chapter as well. Just make sure you don't gloss over there on those. When we get into chapter 10, we're going to deal with a much bigger topic. But if you have any questions, let me know.